afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for AFA's Care Connection webinar series. My name is Christy. I'm the program coordinator here at AFA, and I just want to orient you a little bit. So as a reminder, you will all be in listen-only mode throughout the course of the webinar. Any questions you have can be typed in on the right side of the screen on the control panel. And there are also handouts available for you on there. I'd like to welcome our two speakers today. We have Jennifer Perry, who is the Access Specialist for the Northeast ADA Center and has worked in the accessibility field for over 19 years, with a focus primarily on design and construction issues. She's a registered International Code Council Accessibility Specialist, Plans Examiner, and currently serves as the Vice President of the Board of Directors for the Housing Equality Center of Pennsylvania. We also have Jeffrey Tambor, who is a Training and Content Development Associate for Cornell University's Yang Institute, where he provides training, consultation, and technical support to individuals and organizations, including work for Cornell's Northeast ADA Center, where he provides ADA trainings in New York, New Jersey, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us. And Jennifer and Jeffrey, I will let you take over from here.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Christy, for the introduction. We really appreciate being asked to come and speak through the Care Connection webinar today. So thank you for inviting us. Jeffrey and you'll meet Jeffrey in a second, but when we first started talking about today's presentation, we thought an appropriate title would be what you see here, which is Know Your Rights, Older People and the ADA. We have tried to put together a presentation to give you an overview of the Americans with Disabilities Act, in case you're unfamiliar with the law, but certainly there is much more to learn about the ADA, but we hope that today's program does give you an introduction to the law. So as Christy said, my photograph's on the bottom there. My name is Jennifer Perry, and I work at the Northeast ADA Center. Both Jeffrey and I work for a program called the Yang Institute on Employment and Disability, which is housed within the ILR school at Cornell University. Jeffrey, if you want to unmute, you want to say hi?
Hi. Hi, I am here. This is Jeffrey Tambor, and I'll be talking quite a bit more in a few minutes, but we're really excited to be presenting and meeting with you all today. And as was sort of said at the beginning, don't hesitate to type in questions, or there'll be a couple times we might ask you to answer a true-false question, or there's a couple multiple-choice kind of scenarios. So we're going to ask you for some input at that point. Jen and I are used to presenting in person. So we like to give as much engagement as we can, and at least in the short time we have. So I will talk to you all shortly.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Quickly, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the Northeast ADA Center in case you are not familiar with the ADA centers. What you see here is our toll-free technical assistance number, which is 1-800-949-4232. And the Northeast ADA Center, what we do is we provide training, technical assistance, information for anyone who is interested in learning more about disability in the United States. And we obviously very much focus on the Americans with Disabilities Act. A lot of information about the ADA is available from our website, which is northeastada.org. And we operate that toll-free technical assistance line Monday through Friday from 8:30 to 4:30, where you can call and receive confidential technical assistance regarding any questions you have regarding the ADA or other disability issues. And if you prefer to email questions that you might have, you can do that as well. And our email address is northeastada@cornell.edu. I wanted to mention here that while Jeffrey and I work for the Northeast ADA Center, we are part of a much larger national network, specifically known as the ADA National Network. So no matter where you are in the country, there is an ADA center that serves you. If you call that 1-800 number that you see, 949-4232, you will automatically be directed to the ADA center that serves your region. So that number is universal. If you're in California, you'll be directed to the Pacific ADA Center because they would serve you. The Northeast ADA Center specifically serves New York, New Jersey, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. But as I said, no matter where you are in the country, there absolutely is an ADA center that can provide this type of assistance. So please do feel free to reach out for that confidential and free, I should have mentioned, technical assistance should you be in need of it in the future. Jeffrey and I, we do work for Cornell University, so we obviously have some disclaimers that we must always share whenever we do training programs. So basically, we wanted to let you know that our center, the Northeast ADA Center, we are authorized by the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research to provide information, technical assistance, materials, and training programs like this one today to stakeholders with an interest in the Americans with Disabilities Act. But Jeffrey and I are not attorneys, so please do not construe today's program as legal advice, but rather as technical assistance. So here's a brief agenda that we put together. We thought we would start by doing an overview of the ADA, talking about where it applies, when it applies, and who the ADA applies to. And then focus a little bit on the intersection between the ADA and older people. There'll be a few case scenarios along the way to show how employment is impacted when thinking about the ADA. We'll talk about effective communication, as well as service animals, which have gotten a lot of attention the past few years, particularly in the media. And then talk about healthcare providers and what some of their obligations are under the ADA. So that's the agenda that we put together, and there absolutely will be time for questions at the end of today's presentation. So please do feel free to share your questions or concerns with us. So with that, let's kind of jump into the ADA there. Of course, ADA stands for the Americans with Disabilities Act. And we wanted to try to get you involved here by asking one very easy true or false question. We wanted to see what you think. Is aging considered a disability under the ADA? Now, Christy has told me that you can enter into the question box. If you want to go ahead and put in either a T for true or an F for false. And again, the question is, aging is considered a disability under the ADA. Do you think that's true or false? And I think, Christy, I'm going to need you to let me know what people are responding with there, because I can't see.
Yeah, so right now it's about a 50-50 split between true and false for this one.
Oh, okay. 50-50. Okay, good. Well, just in the interest of time, I'm going to have to move forward, but I will let you all know that this is actually false. Aging is not considered a disability under the ADA, and that's because aging by itself is not an impairment, but somebody who has a medical condition, something like hearing loss or osteoporosis or arthritis, which are often associated with age, has an impairment on the basis of that medical condition. So a person does not have an impairment, however, simply because they have gotten older, because they're more advanced in years. And the ADA does not contain a definitive list of medical conditions that constitute disabilities, but rather the ADA has a general definition of disability that each person must meet. So because of that, some people with age-related impairments will have a disability that's protected under the ADA, and others will not. Under the ADA, a person has a disability if someone has a physical or a mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. And the law also protects people who have a record of having that kind of impairment or someone who was regarded as having such an impairment. And major life activities include things that many of us take for granted that you do on a daily basis. Things like walking and talking and eating and breathing, caring for oneself, going to work, These are all major life activities. So under the ADA, if you have an impairment that substantially limits your ability to walk or to talk or to eat or to breathe or to care for yourself, then you've met the definition of a person with a disability, meaning you are protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act. The intent of the law is that it does cover many individuals. The definition of a person with a disability is not meant to be construed to not include many types of conditions that result from disability. So thank you for participating in that true or false. I appreciate that. At the ADA Center, as I said, we handle a lot of technical assistance calls and questions about the ADA, and sometimes we're amazed at how many people still, frankly, don't quite understand what the ADA is about. So first and foremost, the ADA is a federal civil rights law. It was signed into law in July of 1990. It was amended in 2008. And the goal of the ADA is to achieve equal opportunity and provide equal access for people with disabilities. And there's a photograph here of President George Bush at the signing ceremony for the Americans with Disabilities Act. Of course, he has recently passed, George Bush, but he very much was a very strong proponent for the ADA. And the ADA, when it was signed into law, had very strong bipartisan support from Congress. So for older people, as well as those who serve older people, the ADA really is a tool that can be used to help facilitate continued access to the community. And throughout this webinar, we're going to talk about some ways that the ADA can help support older people. So if you think back to before 1990, certainly society looked very different than it does today in 2018, almost 2019. Some obvious things that were different were the lack of curb cuts at sidewalks. Many businesses were not accessible. Certainly things like public buses, city buses, were not readily accessible. And people with disabilities were not, they were rarely seen in ads and television programming. Interpreters were rarely used at public events, and because of these things, people with disabilities were often excluded from many activities due to these barriers. You see a photograph here of a typical, appears to be an office building with a ramped entrance, and this really highlights how far we've come, because in today's society, we are very accustomed to seeing ramps, and they have become obviously critical for people who use mobility devices to enter a building. But they've also become very useful for the gentleman who is delivering boxes, using the dolly cart, as well as for the mom that you see who is pushing a stroller. So a lot of the requirements of the ADA, particularly those for the built environment, have become very useful to many members of society, of course, including people with disabilities, but certainly others as well. Now, in order to ensure that people with disabilities have this equal opportunity to participate in community life, Congress specifically addressed several key areas that are critical for civic participation when drafting the ADA. And these particular areas are reflected in what's known as the titles of the ADA. And what you see here are those 5 titles of the ADA. So Title I, Jeffrey's going to focus on in a moment, but Title I says that you cannot discriminate against people with disabilities throughout the entire employment process. And the federal agency that enforces the employment provisions of the ADA is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or the EEOC. Title II of the ADA requires access to all activities that are undertaken by your state and local government entities. So some examples of Title II include on election day, when you go and vote, your polling places, they have to be accessible because of Title II of the ADA. Public schools fall under this title, as do your local, county, city, and state court systems, your public libraries, any municipal government offices, even within your Small Town USA recreation program, Parks and Rec Department, these are all examples of programs that have to provide access for those with disabilities under Title II of the law. And then Title III applies to many what are known as public accommodations in the ADA, and some examples are restaurants and hotels, stores, places of business, many doctor's offices, grocery stores. Anything that's open to the public and affects commerce falls under Title III. And I should have mentioned a moment ago, the United States Department of Justice is the federal agency that enforces Title II provisions as well as Title III provisions, with the exception for public transportation, which is enforced by the U.S. Department of Transportation. And then Title IV of the law requires access to telecommunications. And this requires a few things that you might be familiar with, like closed captioning is required on certain types of television programming, as well as phone companies are required to operate a service known as a relay system. And this is what enables individuals who are deaf to communicate via telephone with speaking and hearing individuals through what's known as a relay service. So these are just two examples of the telecommunications provisions of the law. And then Title V contains, what we refer to as the miscellaneous provisions. But one of those most important provisions is protecting the rights of people with disabilities by specifically stating that you cannot be retaliated against for trying to enforce your rights under the ADA. And then with that, Jeffrey, I believe I'm going to let our attendees listen to you for a little bit.
You are. That is correct. Thank you, Jennifer. And what a perfect place for me to sort of officially start. You'll see here on the screen, there's a picture, an image of an artichoke. And although it's sort of I use the artichoke metaphorically, and it's a little bit corny, I know, or you may think it is, but ultimately what I like to share with people is that, and Jen did a great job of going over the ADA and its origins and, talking about the law and the different titles, and all those things are critically important, of course. With the passing of President Bush recently, I think a lot of people, I saw that image in the media a lot, and there was a lot of attention surrounding the ADA, which is wonderful. But I also like to remind people that the ADA is also about non-discrimination for Americans with disabilities, for people with disabilities in our country. And it's really a civil rights law as well. And it's civil rights for people with disabilities, which is why it's such a big deal. So the reason for the artichoke is, if you think about an artichoke, and I use this metaphor in a number of trainings when we try to sort of get to what we call the heart of the matter. So if you look at an artichoke, and for those of you that have had artichokes, the outside leaves are immediately what you see, and they're a little prickly and not necessarily tasty, right? But when you peel back the leaves or the layers of the artichoke, you get to the heart, and the heart's what's really happening, right? And so I like us to think of, maybe we can think of the law and the titles as the leaves that we see and that we know about. But if you really delve deeper into what the purpose is of the ADA, the purpose of the ADA is about non-discrimination and equal opportunity for all citizens. And it states that all people with disabilities must be able to obtain or enjoy the same goods, services, and privileges and advantages that are provided to other members of the public, right? So the idea is that the ADA, and I'll probably bring this up when I talk about employment, isn't about special rights. If I could air quote special, I would. It's about leveling the playing field for people with disabilities. So that's just a key foundational point that I think has always helped me to really understand the importance of this work that we do around the ADA. Oops. There we go. You can. Where's the advance? I know what you're thinking. There it is. Jen's advancing for me today. Thank you. So we're going to talk, as Jennifer mentioned, and this is really going to be a crash course in Title I of the ADA, which Jennifer told us is employment, the employment provisions of the ADA. I believe wholeheartedly in Title I. It's something that I ran an employment program for people with disabilities for many, many years, a program that helped people get integrated community employment. So it's something I've worked at, I've done, and something I believe in. And what's interesting about the employment provisions, and perhaps all the ADA, but certainly with employment, is that you're really talking about, our customers when it comes to Title I, if you will, are job seekers and employees with disabilities, but it's also businesses, right? So, there's multiple entities that are affected, and this is important too for a variety of reasons. Whether it's you're a person with a disability who needs to know your rights when it comes to employment, or you're a business that, you need to know, I suppose you need to know your rights, but you also need to know, what are the expectations of you as a business to level that playing field. So one of the first things I like to talk about with Title I is who is protected. And the ADA says that, and there's a whole presentation one could do on this term, qualified individuals with disabilities. But the reality is that someone needs to be qualified. So when it comes to work and employment, the job applicant or the employee needs to have the skills and experience necessary to perform the job. And it's an important point. It may seem obvious, but access to the ADA when it comes to employment is based upon merit, meaning, and I've worked with a lot of employers in the past who have this misconception that if I hire someone with a disability, I'll never be able to terminate them because I'll get sued. And the reality of the matter is that someone needs to have the skills and experience necessary to perform the job, right? If someone is not able to perform the essential functions of the job, as it says here, with or without a reasonable accommodation, that's not the right job for a person. So, again, this is about leveling that playing field so that people with disabilities have the opportunity to apply for and to work at jobs that they are able and capable of doing. One of the other key bullets here, there'd be many others if we had more time, is that a person is able to perform, as you see, and as I said, the essential functions of the job with or without a reasonable accommodation. I want you to think about, a job application that you filled out or you filled out on behalf of someone else or for yourself, or job interviews. When it comes to job interviews, job applications, this here is the legal question that employers are allowed to ask. You are not allowed to inquire about someone's disability during a job interview or on a job application. And if you think about this question and why this question is important, just think about it for a minute. The truth is that if I have a disability, say, and Jen doesn't, and we both apply for a job, and we both believe we can perform the job, we can both answer yes. Yes, I can perform the essential functions of the job with or without a reasonable accommodation. I have not disclosed at that point that I have a disability. I certainly have a right to disclose, but at this point I have not, and employers are not allowed to ask questions about disability during an interview or on a job application. So this question gets to the point of, I have a disability and maybe I think I need a reasonable accommodation, which I can disclose at any point in time, by the way, during the job application process or even once I'm hired, even once I've tried the job for a while. And if Jen doesn't have a disability, she can answer yes as well, because, again, it's about essential functions. So, Jen, you can go to the next slide. So one of the key points, and this is throughout the ADA, certainly not just when it comes to Title I and employment, but it is a critical point to understand, which is about reasonable accommodation. And this whole idea of reasonable accommodation is in place and the idea is that someone who has a disability who believes they can perform and is able to perform the essential functions of the job may need a reasonable accommodation in order to perform the job. And I want you to think for a minute about this word accommodation. The ADA definition here is that an accommodation is any change in the work environment or in the way things are customarily done that enables an individual with a disability to enjoy equal employment opportunities. It doesn't say special. It doesn't say more opportunities. It doesn't say, increased opportunities. It says equal opportunities. And it goes on to say, and the opportunity to attain the same level of performance or to enjoy equal benefits and privileges of employment. And I like us to think, too, about work as there are aspects of work that are what I might call the non-work elements of work, being able to access break rooms, being able to socialize with coworkers, right? There's a lot of benefits that come with being able to work beyond the actual work duties we do and beyond the paycheck. And so I want us to think for a minute about this word accommodation. I bet if you think about it, we all in our jobs have accommodations. There have been times I've had to ask to leave early one day because my kid was sick, right? Or has a doctor's appointment. And I'll maybe ask to leave early one day and come in late the next, no, not come in late the next day. I guess it would be come in early the next day. It'd be nice to leave early one day and come in late the next day. But the idea is that the accommodation, is made because, think about what an accommodation like that does for us. It helps us feel, enjoy the work we do. It helps us perform our job better. Sometimes what I see happening is that the word disability gets thrown into the mix, and businesses and folks can get all weird about it. And the reality is a reasonable accommodation is there because it helps the person perform their job duties. It might be looking at doing the job duties in a different way than is customarily done at the job. But ultimately, as long as the job gets done, that's what's important. Employers don't have to lower productivity standards. Employers aren't required to do that at all. Ultimately, at the end of the day, employers need to have the job done. And as long as a reasonable accommodation is reasonable and isn't excessive, I'm going to talk about a couple exceptions in a minute. That is the expectation, that the accommodation still helps get the job done. Jen, you can go to the next slide. And just a few key points in our time here today about reasonable accommodation. So I haven't talked about disclosure, and we really don't discuss it much in this presentation, but a reasonable accommodation must be provided to applicants and employees with known disabilities. So that may seem obvious, but if you do not disclose that you have a disability, particularly if it's a non-obvious or sometimes people say invisible or hidden disability, I say non-obvious disability. If an employer doesn't know you have a disability, one is not entitled to the protections of the ADA. So one has to disclose in order to obtain a reasonable accommodation. And in fact, there's data from our researchers here at Cornell. The number one reason people disclose is because they need an accommodation on the job. The next point is that, and this is something that after many years of working in the disability and employment field, I still didn't quite understand until I came to work here at the Northeast ADA Center, which is that a reasonable accommodation is based on what we call an interactive process. So the interactive process is just what it sounds like. The employee needs to request a reasonable accommodation, disclose a disability, and request a reasonable accommodation, and then discuss with the employer what that might be. Maybe the employee suggests one. Maybe the employer suggests one. It doesn't mean that the employee suggests or names a reasonable accommodation. The employer says, no, we can't do that, and that's the end of the conversation. It is meant to be interactive. There's a back and forth, right, where someone suggests something and maybe someone comes up with another idea. Maybe the first accommodation doesn't work and you try something different. But I think it's a key point for folks to understand that it is meant to be interactive, right, that no one person has the best answers and all the ideas. So employers, and this question can come up a lot, employers may collect medical documentation. I like to stress, though, that a request for medical documentation from an employer must be job-related and consistent with business necessity. So it doesn't mean that the employer can have access to an employee's entire medical record. And by the way, that information, that medical information is to remain and be kept confidential. So typically it might be HR and the direct supervisor, or, that has access to that information as related to the job. So the documentation should describe why the documentation is needed. Usually it's to verify the existence of a disability and the need for an accommodation. Documentation might say, for example, and it can come from a medical professional, it could be, depending on what the disability is, it could be from a psychologist, it could be from drug and alcohol abuse counselor. There's any number of allowable medical professionals that could provide the documentation. So that basically the documentation would say that someone has a covered disability, that there are functional limitations that the person experiences because of the disability, and it might also suggest accommodations in the workplace. Again, the accommodations aren't written in stone. They become a part of that interactive process. So a lot of times, these concepts you see here must be provided, reasonable accommodation must be provided unless there is undue hardship or direct threat. So just a real quick description of undue hardship. So undue hardship can mean a couple different things. It can certainly mean, and people sort of know this, and can mean a financial hardship to the business. Although I'll tell you that financial hardship, if you're a part of say a larger company, and they aren't financial hardship doesn't just mean one department and one budget. Undue hardship means across the entire company. If at any point someone were to come in and look at the business's records, they would really look at, does this cause a financial hardship across the entire company? Meaning they would look at the entire organization. So, for example, if you're in a school district, they're not just going to look at the one budget for that one school. They're going to look at the entire school district, right? And so it's good for businesses to know that, when it comes to undue hardship, can sometimes be a little bit hard to prove, right? The other can be a disruption of the work process, right? So undue hardship might be, let's say there's a small business and there's, 2 employees only, and it's a business with shift work, and one of the employees requests that they only work 9 to 5 and can't work any of the second or third shifts or what have you, and it's a very small number of employees. That could be an example, and I stress could be, of disruption to the work process, right, because it's an administrative burden to the business. A lot of the answers we give to ADA scenarios are, it depends, because it really depends on the case and the scenario. Direct threat, really quickly, is something that you might say can trump the ADA, and what I mean there is that the threat has to be, if for some reason someone believes that an employee will be a direct threat to the business, maybe because of their disability, or they'll be a harm to themselves or others. So, for example, direct threat doesn't mean, I suspect this person has a mental health disability, or they disclose they have bipolar disorder, and, I saw in the media about people with mental health disabilities, so I'm worried. That's not credible and evidence-based. Direct threat needs to be credible, evidence-based, imminent, and concrete, not based on vague suppositions or unlikely scenarios. So direct threat might be you're a bus driver and you're slurring your speech and you're stumbling when you're walking into work, whether it's due to substance, maybe you don't know, for whatever reason. Maybe the person has a medical situation or something else. That is direct threat, because obviously that bus driver, could, potentially cause harm to many people when he or she is driving the bus. So that's just a real quick, some real quick information about reasonable accommodation, and just some examples on the next slides that I'm going to share with you. So these are examples, although there's no hard and fast rule, these are examples of accommodations that are often considered reasonable. So it could be modifications to increase facility accessibility, right, to make a building accessible for people with disabilities. Could be restructuring a job, for somebody, or flexible scheduling. So maybe someone takes a medication due to the disability that makes them groggy in the morning. So a flexible schedule, again, if it's a reasonable accommodation and doesn't cause an undue hardship, could be considered reasonable. Acquiring new equipment to help someone do their job better. Maybe it's a trackball instead of a regular mouse, because for someone, who has fine motor challenges. Qualified readers or interpreters, think sign language interpreters at a job. Modification of the application and testing procedures or training materials. Maybe someone needs something in Braille or large print. Maybe someone needs a test read to them, right, due to a disability. And allowing a job coach or another person, like a job coach, a professional at a work site, could be considered a reasonable accommodation under the ADA. Not so much eliminating the essential job functions. Again, I said employers never have to eliminate essential job functions. They have to accommodate them, but not eliminate them, because that's what the job exists for. I already mentioned lowering production standards applied to all employees. If there's a production standards, and I think this is a myth out there that businesses sometimes don't understand, you should not and do not have to expect less from employees with disabilities. Providing personal use items, so things like hearing aids, eyeglasses, employers don't have to provide. Changing an employee supervisor is an interesting one, but I won't get into it now, but it actually is not considered, and the courts have proven that, have backed this up, is not considered a reasonable accommodation under the ADA. And excusing a violation of uniformly applied conduct rules. If you have an attendance policy and you're late 3 times and you're suspended or you're fired or whatever, making that one up, the same rule should apply to people with disabilities, right? It should not be any different. We're not talking about special treatment here. So a few examples, I think actually I have a couple, maybe just one quick example. Yes, have one quick example today of what I call situations and solutions. And I'll just ask you to really quickly think about this. An individual with osteoarthritis and walking limitations has difficulty accessing his work site. So, Jen, you can go to the next slide just in the interest of time. Some possible solutions for that person. And notice these could typically be a disability someone might acquire as we all grow older. Accessible parking spaces is one example. Or in a parking space certainly closer to the person's office or place of business. An accessible parking space doesn't help someone if it's across campus or wherever it is you work. An office close to the entrance for someone that might need that, or moving the individual, the worker, closer to the common office equipment area if a person has mobility issues. That's just one, and there could be many examples of reasonable accommodation. So I have a couple of what I think are fun case scenarios, and I'm going to read the scenario to you, and then there's going to be some choices, A, B, C, D. I'm going to ask you at that point to type in the choice. So the first scenario I call Sandra, Sadie, Sylvia, and the survey. Sandra works for a senior center in her community and has been charged with disseminating a survey on the needs of older people in her community along with their caregivers. The center's practice is to distribute information through hard copy mailing and email when possible. Sadie receives the survey in the mail. Sadie doesn't use email and wants to complete it, but due to cognitive challenges related to dementia, she has difficulty understanding the questions. So Sadie asks her daughter, who's named Sylvia, for assistance, but Sylvia, Sadie's daughter, is legally blind and cannot make out the questions either in the format that they're in. Sylvia contacts Sandra at the senior center and asks her if someone can come over to help them complete the survey. Sandra, who's, again, I know these are confusing S names. Sandra at the senior center says, well, we don't have the staffing for this. And she tells Sylvia just to disregard the survey. Okay. So here are the questions, and one of these is correct. Is it choice A? Since the survey is optional and not a required service, the center is not obligated to provide support in this area. Choice B, assisting Sadie and Sylvia with the survey is not required, but an example of a best practice. C, the center must offer the survey to Sadie in an alternate format since she is the one receiving services, but not to her caregiver. Or D, the center must offer the survey to both Sadie and her daughter in alternate format. So quickly type in A, B, C, D. No, nothing scientific here, nothing too hard. I'm not going to call you out. Actually, Christy's going to have to tell us what people are typing. What do you think,
so a lot of folks are saying D. We also have one person for A and a couple people saying B. Okay, but D seems to be the most common option.
Well, I have to tell you, you can go to the answer, Jen, that you are a very astute group because D is the correct answer. The center must offer the survey to both Sadie and her daughter in alternate formats. I often have groups who are very split on this one, so I'm impressed that you got that. Basically what this comes down to, I'll just shorten my response here in the interest of time, is that, remember earlier I talked about the ADA, that people have to have access to the benefits and privileges. Well, in this case, it's not employment, but, leveling that playing field. So in this example, they are offering a survey. Yes, the survey is optional, but it is true also that they want to complete the survey. And so in order for Sadie to complete the survey, she needs assistance of her daughter, I believe it is, Sylvia. So the center is obligated to provide the survey to both of them in alternate formats. Now, that doesn't have to be a home visit. It could be, some other method. It could be a large print version for the daughter. It could be doing it on the phone, right? So thank you for that. We can go on to our next scenario. Oh, I'm sorry. Before I do that, just a few quick things here. Remember, it's all about providing equal access to goods and services, and this example sort of gets to providing equal access. Sometimes it means making reasonable modifications to rules and practices. So it may not be enough to say, well, we have a policy, we won't go to the home. Well, maybe we need to make an exception because sometimes policies and procedures can discriminate inadvertently against people with disabilities. Staying ahead of the curve in this example could be, You know, in some examples, we want to remove architectural barriers. Jen talked a lot about that in her trainings. We want to remove communication barriers for people. Maybe it's through sign language or offering an alternate format, and transportation barriers for people. We talked about offering the survey in alternate formats. The whole idea here is that communication needs to be effective, right? And effective is really, it can be different. So I might need something communicated in one way if I'm requesting an accommodation. Jennifer might need it in another way, just because no two people experience their world in exactly the same way. You can go on, Jen. Our next question is, and I'm wondering, how is our time, Christy? Because I know we want time for questions. And
we've got about 20, so we've got 20 minutes left. I'd say at least leave 10 minutes for questions.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. So then I'll do the scenario. If we can have 10 minutes, that'll give me enough time. And then Jen, we don't have too much here, but the scenario takes a minute. But it's fun. So this one's called Catalina and the Caregiver. Catalina is a caregiver coordinator for a county-operated center. She receives an email from Grace, a daughter who is caring for her 86-year-old father. Grace would like to schedule a meeting with Catalina in 2 weeks to discuss options for meeting her father's increasing needs. Grace states that she also would like to discuss the physical and emotional impact this is having on her and on her relationship with her husband and children. In the email, Grace informs Catalina that she is deaf and will need a sign language interpreter for the meeting. Catalina mentions the request to her supervisor, who states that they don't have money in the budget to cover the cost of the interpreter. Let me tell you anecdotally from work I do, this comes up a lot, and particularly I know it comes up in medical practices. I know from my own county I live in New York State. So this is something that happens. It's out there. Choices, the best course of action. Catalina should arrange for a sign language interpreter to attend the meeting since effective communication is required under the ADA. B, the department is not obligated to cover the cost of the interpreter since the expense would cause an undue burden. C, Catalina can suggest that Grace is welcome to bring her own interpreter, such as a friend or relative. Or D, Catalina can let Grace know that although the county can't afford the cost of an interpreter, they can pass notes back and forth during the meeting. So what do you think? A, B, C, D? What do we have there, Christy?
It looks like D is a popular answer.
D is the popular. Yep.
Yeah, we also have 1A and 1C.
1A and 1C. Okay, so let's go to the answer. The correct answer based on the information we have is A, that in order to provide effective communication, Catalina should arrange for a sign language interpreter to attend the meeting since effective communication is required under the ADA. The reason that there isn't enough information here in this scenario to feel like it would cause undue burden financially to this practice. And in this example, it is, if I remember correctly, a county-operated center, which implies that we're not just looking at the budget for one location. C is not correct because Catalina can suggest that you bring her own interpreter. That is never appropriate. If someone certainly insists that they want their own person, that's another thing, but it is never appropriate for a friend or relative. You know, sometimes we're talking medical terminology, you know, information of a sensitive nature, the relationship. And passing notes, typically, in this scenario, it talks about significant emotional issues going on. You know, passing notes is fine if it's, hey, you know, which way is the restroom, or, you know, a real quick yes or no kind of thing. Certainly passing notes or some sort of quick handwritten note could be sufficient, but for this kind of meeting where it's more in-depth and it's more serious and it's more, there could be medical terminology or emotional terminology, you know, an interpreter would be the best way to do that. So the next slide, this brings us to the concept of effective communication. So here it says public entities, which is Title II, but also even with private entities, you know, for places of business, whether they're a public entity or a private entity, a private business, they're required to ensure that applicants, participants, and members of the public have communication access that is as effective as that provided to people without disabilities. So the idea here is that the communication needs to be effective, right? So in order for who was it? In order for Grace and her, to participate in the meeting and have effective communication. In our example, the ASL, the sign language interpreter, was the best way for her to go about that. So just some other examples of, well, actually, yeah, let's go to this slide. So staying ahead of the curve, public entities must give primary consideration to the communication preference of a person with disability. What essentially that means is, so for Title II entities like this example, whether it's state and local government, this is county-operated center, the public entity needs to give primary consideration to the preference of the person with a disability. A business, on the other hand, say a supermarket or a department store or what have you, only has to look at what they believe is an effective method, even if it isn't the best method. It still has to be effective. That's a nuance there. If undue burden exists, it must still provide the next best means of effective communication. So just because, let's say that doing the home visit was an undue burden, and it could be proven, then what's another way? You aren't off the hook for making the accommodation. You cannot charge fees related to providing effective communication, so charges cannot be passed on to the patient or the client. You can't charge someone for the accommodation that you offer them in any way. There's no service charges or anything like that. And the idea here is to think about universal access, that we find that, and if you think about Jen's picture in the beginning, of the ramp that was benefiting the mom and the UPS worker and the person in a wheelchair. Having information available in different formats benefits everybody. I can't tell you how many times I've pressed those blue buttons when my hands are full with packages or my training materials going into buildings. That's universal access. I think we're up to Jen. Are you taking over from here?
Yes, I am. Thank you, Jeffrey. So thank you very much, Jeffrey. And I know we only have a few minutes left, but I certainly wanted to just touch on a few other areas where the ADA has had significant impact. So a few of when we think of physical accessibility requirements, and I know this slide says considerations for medical providers, but many of the features that are listed here apply to all, both places of public accommodation as well as to state and local government types of facilities. So the ADA basically says that if you provide parking for your customers or for your clients, you then also have to provide accessible parking spaces. Physical accessibility includes having things like an accessible entrance, a way for people to navigate throughout your office space or throughout your business. If you have things like registration desks, those have to be accessible to people with disabilities, meaning not 4 or 5 feet tall. You also want to consider the layout of the waiting room. Sometimes the room is designed and constructed as accessible, but when you arrange the chairs and the coffee tables and other types of equipment, that once accessible waiting room can very easily become inaccessible. So the good news is it's an easy fix, doesn't usually cost anything, but it's something to be aware of so that you can better serve people with disabilities. Where toilet rooms are provided, those must be accessible. And things like elevators are great, obviously, for providing, vertical accessibility, but they have to be maintained. They have to be in good working order. So making sure that you're maintaining all these features that directly impact people with disabilities is another expectation under the ADA. And specifically for medical providers, you want to provide accessible examination rooms. And as a person with a disability, you have a right to receive treatment in the same manner and as thoroughly as the treatment that's provided for patients without disabilities. So that may necessitate things like accessible exam tables or accessible examination chairs. At the end of the day, your exam, as I said, should be as thorough as that's provided for other patients. And again, that might necessitate accessible equipment. If you have any questions about these features, as I said, you can certainly contact us or a local ADA center to learn more about these specific topics. And there's a wonderful free resource called adachecklist.org that walks you through if you wanted to assess the accessibility of a particular building. And it walks you through how to do that. It's an excellent resource. As I said earlier, I know we're a little short on time, but service animals certainly are of great benefit to many individuals with disabilities, and they've gotten a lot of attention lately. But the ADA defines a service animal as a dog that is individually trained to do work or perform tasks for people with disabilities. There is one exception to the species rule of dogs, and that is allowing miniature horses. Those can also serve as service animals under the ADA if they are trained to do work or perform tasks for people with disabilities. Now, many people are familiar with guide dogs that assist people who are blind, but service dogs can actually be trained to perform a lot of different types of tasks, like alerting people who are deaf of hazards, pulling somebody's wheelchair, alerting someone who may be about to have a seizure, or reminding someone with mental illness to take, it's time to take your medication. They can be trained to calm somebody with post-traumatic stress disorder during an anxiety attack. And there's a very long list of other duties that service dogs can be trained to do. But the distinction of what makes a service animal under the ADA is that they are trained to do work or perform tasks for people with disabilities. If you have a dog whose sole function is really to provide comfort to someone, meaning the presence of the dog provides emotional support, those are not protected under the ADA as service dogs. Because again, that distinction is service dogs must be trained to perform a specific task to assist someone with a disability. And the ADA regulations are very clear about what questions can and cannot be asked of somebody with a disability that may enter, as an example, your business, the service animal. And there are the two questions here. Is the animal required because of a disability? And what work or tasks has the animal been trained to perform? Those really are the only two questions that can be asked of somebody who comes in with a service dog. Many people choose to purchase identifying vests or wallet cards, and that is entirely an option that people with disabilities have, but the ADA does not require people to purchase those types of identifying vest or wallet cards. But service dogs do have to be under control of their handler. They are not permitted to run around and be barking and growling or disruptive. They have to absolutely be under the control of their handler. And a well-trained service dog is very, you almost don't even notice them. So just to kind of wrap everything up here, some of the best practices when you think about disability inclusion are, reminding yourself to think about if you're offering an event or a program or an activity, are we thinking through how we are serving people with disabilities? So offer accessible events, being aware of alternative formats. We discussed some in Jeffrey's scenario, being willing to do so if necessary. And if you have questions, you can always call your local ADA center for that confidential technical assistance if you need some support. And again, that support comes at no cost to your organization. So here we are back again with our photo of George H.W. Bush at the signing ceremony of the ADA. And the spirit of the ADA, we hope we relate to you. As Jeffrey said, it's you peel back those layers of the artichoke and you get to non-discrimination. We hope that this overview today of the ADA has illustrated how this law directly impacts older Americans. And remember that prior to the passage of this law of the ADA, growing older was also often equivalent to having very limited choices for independence, whether in the housing context or regarding, going about your daily tasks, things like shopping or going out to eat or going to work or visiting your family, going to the doctor. The ADA has directly impacted all of these areas, and it's also expanded the options older Americans have in those key areas that we talked about in those titles of the law. So thank you for giving Jeffrey and I the opportunity to introduce the ADA to you today. And here, just as a reminder, is our 1-800 number should you have any questions. You can certainly reach out. There's also a link that you can use to find your local regional ADA center. And based on the topics we touched on, we've assembled some resources, including the Job Accommodation Network, which is of great use, particularly if you have employment-related questions around the ADA and reasonable accommodations that Jeffrey discussed. There's a number of fact sheets that are very useful about topics like physical accessibility and service animals available from the ADA National Network. And the U.S. Department of Justice has a number of fact sheets as well on things like effective communication. Another fact sheet that discusses how accessibility benefits older adults. And then if you're interested in learning more about public transportation and accessibility, we have another resource listed here. And with that, I think we have, concluded our slides. Please do feel free to reach out to Jeffrey or I if you have any questions about today's presentation. And I do want to be sure to share the AFA resources and support slide as well. So, Christy, I don't know, do you have any questions that have come in for Jeffrey or I?
Yeah, so first of all, I just want to thank the two of you for joining us today and providing us with all this great information. We have a few minutes left, so if anyone has questions, go ahead and type them in now, so we can give folks a couple minutes on that. Just a reminder to everyone listening in, the topic for next month, our next webinar will be on January 10th, and it's going to be about strategies to reduce peer-to-peer bullying or other antagonistic behaviors among older adults. All right, well, we'll give it another minute or two with the questions if anyone has any. Someone asked if we can put the 800 number back up on the screen, three slides back.
Absolutely, I'd be happy to. It's 1-800-949-4232.
Okay, great. All right, we have a couple people who have just said thank you. They appreciated hearing all this content today.
Wonderful.
Our pleasure. Thank you, everybody.
Great. Well, if there's nothing else, we can go ahead and close. Thank you again, both of you, for joining us today, and I hope all of you tune in again next month.
Oh, thank you very much, Christy. Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Yes, thanks, everyone. Have a great day.